Imagine two individuals enduring the exact same season of waiting. They face the same unanswered prayer, the same unfulfilled promise, and the exact same agonizing stretch of time. Yet, when they reach the other side, one emerges stronger, deeper, and far more grounded than when they entered. The other comes out bitter, spiritually hollowed out, carrying only a fraction of the faith they once held. The external circumstances were identical, yet the outcomes were worlds apart. The defining variable was not what God did during that season, it was what each person did on the inside. This is no small distinction. In Scripture, it marks the difference between an entire generation that perished in the wilderness and two men who stepped into the promised land at 85 years old, still robust, vibrant, and strong enough to conquer a mountain. Caleb spent 40 long years in the exact same desert as those who died there. He ate the same manna, drank from the same miraculous rock, endured the same scorching sun, and breathed the same dry sand. Yet when the ordeal was finally over, he stood before Joshua and declared, "I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I am just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then. Now give me this hill country." 40 years in a barren wasteland, and the man emerged with more strength than he had when he went in. This did not happen despite the waiting. It happened through it. Such resilience never occurs by accident, nor does it result from simply sitting around. Most people view waiting as a passive state. You stop, you sit, you hold your breath, you passively endure until something finally changes. That is precisely how the wilderness generation approached their delay. They stopped progressing. They looked back longingly at Egypt, grumbled endlessly, and walked in literal circles for 4 decades. They were waiting only in the sense that time was passing while they held their position, but they were not practicing what Scripture calls waiting on the Lord. Vro. The distinction is critical because the Bible is remarkably precise on this matter. Isaiah 40:31 promises, "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint." The word translated as wait in that verse is the Hebrew word Kava. It does not mean what we typically mean when we speak of waiting. The literal root of Kava means to twist, braid, or bind together, like the process of weaving individual strands into a thick rope. Picture loose, fragile threads lying side by side. On its own, each thread breaks with the slightest tension. But when you tightly intertwine those exact same threads, something extraordinary happens. The strength of every strand compounds, transforming them into a rope far stronger than any individual thread could ever be. That is Kava. That is the active reality Isaiah describes. Waiting on God is not the act of standing still. It is the deliberate process of binding yourself tightly to Him in the middle of a season when nothing else is moving. It is an active weaving of your weakness into His strength, your confusion into His wisdom, and your finite timeline into His eternal purpose. The waiting season is the very place where this binding occurs. Two people can share the same desert. One remains a loose thread fraying in the heat, while the other is woven into something unbreakable. The vital question is not how long you have been waiting, but what you are doing while you wait. Before we examine what waiting on God looks like, we must be honest about what passive waiting looks like. Most people stuck in a delay are practicing passive waiting without realizing it. It has a distinct, draining texture defined by mindsets oriented toward what is missing, rather than toward God Himself. The first posture of passive waiting is chronic complaint. This was Israel's primary occupation in the desert. They murmured, a word appearing more than a dozen times in Exodus and Numbers to describe their behavior. They complained about the food, the water, their leaders, and their lost past. This grumbling was not harmless venting. It was a sustained orientation of the heart, away from God and toward scarcity. Complaint in a waiting season whispers, "The thing I lack matters far more than the God who is present." When this becomes your dominant mindset, The season produces nothing of value. It simply consumes your life. The second posture of passive waiting is backward focus. Israel repeatedly returned to Egypt in their minds, lamenting, "We remember the fish we ate in Egypt for nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic." They were headed toward a land flowing with milk and honey, yet they romanticized their former bondage simply because the misery was familiar. Backward focus causes people to say, "My life was better before I started following God." This is rarely an honest assessment. It is a distorted memory of what you left behind, viewed through the lens of what you do not yet possess, and it will keep you circling in place forever. The third posture is outcome fixation, measuring every single day strictly by whether your breakthrough has arrived. You wake up and immediately ask, "Has anything changed yet?" You pray, but the core of your prayer is merely, "When?" You evaluate God's faithfulness solely by whether the delay is over, and when it isn't, you conclude that God is silent, distant, or unconcerned. This posture will hollow you out. While it is true that the promise has not yet arrived, the conclusion you draw from that fact is false. God is not absent from your waiting season. He is often doing his most crucial transformative work right in the middle of it. The generation that died in the wilderness had fresh manna every morning, the visible cloud of God's presence by day, and the pillar of fire by night. They were living inside an unprecedented miracle of divine provision, yet they missed it entirely because their eyes were locked on what they lacked. Now, let us look at what active waiting on God actually looks like. This path is neither easy nor comfortable, but it produces an entirely different result. The first mark of waiting on God is present faithfulness rather than future paralysis. Joseph in prison is the supreme example of this. At 17, he received 2 prophetic dreams promising that his family would bow before him. Yet 13 years later, after being thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and abandoned in a dungeon, the promise looked utterly dead. Joseph did not sit in the corner of his cell staring at the wall, waiting for circumstances to change. Scripture notes that the Lord was with Joseph, and the warden placed him in charge of all the prisoners. He rose to leadership in a dungeon just as he had in Potiphar's house. He understood that faithfulness in the present moment is not separate from future preparation. It is the preparation. Someone waiting on God remains active, but their activity is no longer driven by anxiety over the outcome. They do the task in front of them, with excellence and integrity, trusting God with the things beyond their control. The second mark of waiting on God is honest prayer that moves toward Him rather than away from Him. David wrote most of his psalms while waiting, running from Saul, taking refuge in damp caves, and hiding from the army of the king he was anointed to replace. Read those psalms carefully, and you will discover breathtaking vulnerability. In Psalm 13, he cries out, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" That is raw, unvarnished honesty. Yet notice where that same psalm ends. "But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me." This shift from anguish to praise does not occur because his circumstances suddenly shifted. It happens because David processed his pain with God. He brought his complaints to God, not just about God. Honest prayer in a waiting season is not meant to manipulate the situation. It reorients the heart. The third mark of waiting on God is the active practice of memory, deliberately rehearsing what God has already done. When delays stretch on, our natural instinct is to fixate entirely on an uncertain future. David did the exact opposite. He systematically recalled the Exodus, recounted God's wondrous deeds throughout history, and listed the personal deliverances he had experienced. He turned his attention from what God had not yet done toward what God had already accomplished. This is not denial, it is grounded evidence. In a season of uncertainty, the record of God's past faithfulness is the firmest foundation available. The fourth mark of waiting on God is refusing to force open a door before God unlocks it. David had two distinct opportunities to end his waiting season by taking King Saul's life. Twice, Saul was delivered into his hands. His men urged him, "God has given your enemy into your power. This is your moment." David refused both times. When he merely cut a corner of Saul's robe in the dark, his conscience struck him, and he said, "The Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed." Then he returned to waiting. This is perhaps the hardest test of all, because there will almost always be an easy human shortcut available. But those who wait on God know the difference between a door opened by divine grace and a door forced open by human striving. They recognize that God's timing prepares the person for the promise, just as much as it prepares the promise for the person. This brings us to the Caleb principle. Caleb was one of 12 spies sent to survey Canaan. He and Joshua brought back a minority report. "The land is good. God is with us. We can take it." The other 10 spies spread fear, and the nation gave in to unbelief. As a result, God sentenced them to 40 years of desert wandering. Caleb, who had faith, who was entirely right, had to march back into the wilderness alongside everyone else. He suffered a delay caused not by his own failure, but by the unbelief of others. 40 years later, an 85-year-old Caleb walked into Joshua's tent and declared, "The Lord has kept me alive these 45 years, and now behold, I am 85 years old today. I am still as strong today as I was on the day Moses sent me out. My strength now is as my strength was then." 40 years in the exact same desert that destroyed a generation, yet Caleb emerged stronger. How? Because Caleb did not waste his waiting. Scripture records twice that he followed the Lord wholeheartedly. He kept worshipping, kept obeying, and kept believing in a promise that every piece of surrounding evidence contradicted. At 85, his physical resilience matched his inner faith. The waiting season does not determine your final condition, it merely reveals it. For the person who uses the delay to bind themselves tightly to God, the season produces a depth of character that no shortcut could ever achieve. It produces a Caleb, an 85-year-old warrior with the vigor of a young man, standing before a mountain and declaring, "Give me this." Consider these 4 diagnostic questions to evaluate your current posture. First, is your prayer during this season drawing you toward God, or are you merely complaining about your situation while keeping Him at a distance? Second, are you serving faithfully in your present moment like Joseph, or have you put your life on hold until your circumstances improve? Third, what are you mentally rehearsing? God's track record of past faithfulness, or the catalogue of things you still lack? Fourth, is there a door you are actively trying to force open in your own strength, or are you willing to leave the timing in His hands? When Caleb asked for his mountain, the giants were still living there, and war was still required. But 45 years of Kava, of binding himself to God, had forged a man who was undaunted by the challenge. The waiting had not eroded him, it had made him capable of holding what the promise contained. Whatever you are waiting for today, your current season is not empty space. Something is being woven. The only question is whether you are allowing yourself to be bound to Him.